it's meandering, it is exploratory, it is all those things that a zero draft should be, which is bad. Everyone, my name is Tara East. I'm a writer, blogger, YouTuber, and the author of the mystery novel Every Time He Dies. And in this video, I want to talk about preparing for a first draft. Now, a quick caveat, I filmed this video a week ago and there was absolutely no audio, so here we are, refilming it. Hopefully I can keep the same energy that was in the initial video. Now, before we dive into the content of this video, I first want to acknowledge that there is so much information out there online about how to write a first draft. A lot of this information is evergreen, meaning it's quite generic and very general. So I'm hoping that some of the things I talk about in this video are new to you and that they seem maybe like fresh information. So a few months ago, I shared my process for creating a zero draft. Now, I finished that draft about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I really wanted to share what I'm doing right now to prepare for the writing of my first official draft of this new novel. Now, don't get too hung up on the language I'm using here. I call my first draft my zero draft, as it's a way to give myself permission for that draft to be messy and scrappy and exploratory. It's really a draft that I'm writing for me, and I hold absolutely no perfection around it. Now with my first draft, I'm trying to be a little bit more structured and intentional. So that's the way I sort of frame it for myself. Now I'd just like to spend a minute talking about word count for just a second. So when I set out to write my zero draft, I really wanted to hit 150k. My new novel, the one I'm currently working on, is a secondary world fantasy. And these books just tend to be longer, ranging anywhere from 120k to 220k. Now, of course, there are outliers on both ends of that scale, but in general, most books in this category fall in that range somewhere. Now, my 2 previous novels are around the 80k mark. So I wanted to hit 150k for my fantasy book so that it would meet genre expectations, but also because I wanted to challenge myself. 150k is just shy of double the length of my 2 previous books, and I wanted to see if I could create a story, if I could sustain a story for that length. I really wanted to get a sense of what it takes to write a story that is that long. In the end, though, my zero draft wrapped up at 140k words exactly. Now, just because I am me, I seriously did consider just pushing the story for another 10k, but I ultimately knew that that was just kind of silly. Now, I do want to clarify, this is not 140,000 good words. The book is loose, it's spooling, it's meandering, it is exploratory, it is all those things that a zero draft should be, which is bad. Of course, there are scenes in this version of the book that are entirely purposeless, because that's kind of the point of a zero draft. Before I jump into what I'm doing right now to prepare for draft 1, I just wanted to reflect on a few things I learned while writing this zero draft. So the first thing I thought when I typed the end was, yay! And the second was, but I don't really like it. Now, most writers are going to flip between loving and hating what they are working on. But overall, to be honest, I'm not very impressed with the plot or the characterization that emerged intuitively during this particular draft. When the draft was done, I did do some serious reflection on what I liked about the zero draft, and that included the premise. I think the premise is genuinely interesting. There were some aspects of the world building that I thought were really unique and cool. There were some plot developments, and I like the character archetypes that I'm working with. Then I thought about what I actively disliked about the book. So what didn't work? Where was I maybe lacking originality, or where did things just become boring? Then I considered the parts of the novel that I was indifferent towards, the various aspects that were just fine or okay. I didn't hate them or love them, they were just inoffensively beige. So that's the first thing I did. I went through those 3 steps. What did I love? What did I hate? What was I indifferent to? Now, to be honest, I tried to create an outline before that zero draft, but honestly, I struggled. So instead, what I did was some light world building, some ID generation, some mind mapping, and thought dumps about what the book could be like. So once I had those sort of loose ideas down, I really just let my intuition lead the way. And look, I did come up with some good ideas during the actual draft and during the writing process. And there were some plot developments that were not on my radar before I started writing. So these types of ideas and inspirations and discoveries can only happen, I feel, when you are in the act of writing and your brain is actually responding to the story that came before. I think there is a different type of creative energy that emerges when you're outlining a book versus when you're actually writing and creating a story. And sometimes we maybe have to swap and switch between those 2 types of creativity. So now that I've finished that zero draft, I know so much more about the story, including what I don't want it to be, and that is actually really important information. So as I mentioned, before creating the zero draft, I struggled to create an outline. So despite this precedent, I would really like an outline before doing my zero draft. I know that seems kind of silly, but I feel like I know so much more about the book that now I can create an outline, whereas before the zero draft, it was just not happening. So I want to create a reasonable outline before my first draft. It does not have to be a play-by-play, chapter-by-chapter, scene-by-scene outline, but I want a good sweeping idea of what the overall narrative is going to be. I really wanted and want to think deeper about what the book is going to feel like, the aesthetics of the book, its overall structure, and what the narrative drive is going to be, which is an aspect that was missing from the zero draft. So what did I do? The first thing I did was grab 2 fantasy novels that I really love and that have completely different strengths, and then I pulled them apart. I read the books over 2 weeks, so 1 book 1 week, 1 book the next week, and I took really meticulous notes about what happened in every chapter. I was basically reverse engineering the book to see how they were put together in terms of plot, character, pacing, and story threads. Now, I don't think you need to do this, but I found it really helpful. Obviously, there are a slew of story models online that you can look up, and that can be really helpful. So things like Save the Cat or the hero or heroine's journey, things like that. But these particular types of structures, like Save the Cat, felt a little too zoomed out to be useful to me at this point right now. I really wanted to understand how a story of this scale and this scope, so an epic fantasy novel, how that kind of story operated on a chapter level and progressed on that chapter level. I wanted to see how many subplots, how many story threads are really required, and how the story turns every 1 to 4 pages, which is something I noticed during this reading. So I learned completely different lessons from dissecting these 2 books. And now I'm not going to mention the books by name, because some of the things I say here, if I mention them and then you go and read the book, it's going to color your reading and your experience of the book, and I would hate to taint anybody's reading experience in that way. So here are some of the things that I did learn. So one of the books was super plotty, and it was really fantastic in terms of understanding pacing and how to build a layered scene. Almost every scene in the book had 3 or 4 story threads present at any one time. So for example, that could be character struggle, family relationships and dynamics, friendships, or romantic tension. There was always more than one thing going on. The only scenes that were focused on one story thread were action scenes, specifically battles, and romantic scenes. So of course, this makes sense because to include other story threads in those kinds of scenes could break the tension that that scene is trying to establish. So for example, if your hero is in an epic battle scene, you don't want to cut away to some sort of internal dialogue about their family drama or the fight that they're having with a friend, because that is drawing your attention away from the immediacy and the tension that you're trying to build with the battle scene. The other book that I read was incredibly character driven, but one of the most important lessons I got from that book was its incredible focus. So almost every aspect of the narrative linked back to a part of the world building. So the plot and the character drama was 100% the result of an event that took place in the world. And this made the entire book feel really tight, like it was all hanging from one particular point, and then all of these aspects were working together. It basically felt like there was no fat. There were no spare parts in the book. Now, here are some of the overall commonalities that both of these books had. So I noticed that both of them had secrets, both in terms of the character, but also in terms of the world. There was also a secret embedded in the world itself. So of course, when these secrets were revealed, hello, plot twist. The protagonists of both books were also flawed, which is of course quite a common thing. We want to give our characters flaws, but something that was really well done was that the side characters were always fleshed out and they always had their own lives. They didn't feel like little paper cutouts. The final thing that I noticed, and this is quite interesting, the external conflict always crossed with the protagonist's internal conflict, and sometimes in more than one way. So if the world was an antagonist, that antagonist was pushing the protagonist's buttons. So this was something that was quite interesting, where the character was interacting and coming up against the world in a way where the world was a huge part of the plot itself. The world was not simply acting as an interesting setting or a backdrop to character drama. So once I finished my close readings and had all these great insights and notes written down, I felt as though I had gained a lot more insight into how to sustain tension over the course of a very large novel. I also learned techniques around world building and how to construct multiple intersecting narrative arcs, and so on. So these are two very long books that I dissected. So I also got a sense of how many different story threads are needed to really keep a story interesting and moving forward. You can't just be focused on the one quest. There has to be other stuff happening. So in short, I really got an idea of how much content I had to generate to keep that story afloat. When I read these books as a reader, I did not pay attention to the number of story threads that existed. Whenever I spoke about the book to someone else, I always focused on that main thread, that main narrative drive, the quest or whatever it was. And that is the part of the book that I would speak to. But of course, the book contained many more story threads than just that one main narrative drive. So once I had all these insights, I have just recently finished putting this new outline together. So once I understood how important world building was, that's where I started first. So the first thing I did was figure out my world and really dive deeply into it. So I was happy with the basic premise I had for the world, but I really wanted to flesh it out more. And once I started doing this, of course, I instantly started generating more ideas for the plot, which I jotted down and pushed to the side until later. As part of the world building exercise, of course, I did do some research as well, but a lot was also based on existing knowledge that I had gained from a previous writing project. So once the world building was done, then I moved on to character. And that includes outlining the main characters, the side characters, and the minor characters. So I gave each character a backstory. I loosely outlined their narrative arc as an individual and how that would intersect with other characters, particularly my protagonist. So this too, of course, yay, resulted in more plot ideas. I then also gave each character, or at least all of my main characters, a significant character flaw, and most of them got a secret. So once I had finished world building and character, and I cherry-picked all the additional ideas that came up through that exercise, I then took those plot ideas as well as my existing plot ideas and organized them into beginning, middle, and end. I then went through these 3 sections and started to play around with various ideas and brainstorming and asking myself what if as a way to flesh out these sections. So again, I did do some research here, particularly around the rise and fall of empires, famous rebellions and revolutions and all that kind of good stuff. And all that information helped with idea generation. So in the end, this produced a 20-page Word document. But I'm not quite diving into the first draft yet. So as I mentioned, I'm very happy with the character archetypes that I'm working with, but I would like my characters to have a bit more style, personality, and I want to be more familiar with the voice of this book. So basically, what I'm doing right now is I'm writing 100 small snippets in the POV of my main characters. So these snippets are sometimes inspired by plot points that I've mapped out, or sometimes they're just little glimpses into how that character sees the world. I'm really not being precious with the quality of this. It's just an exercise in me developing and getting to know my characters more and how my characters are interacting with other characters and how they are perceiving particular events. And now the cool thing about this exercise is that it feels as though I'm writing little summaries and little snippets of scenes that I will be writing in the first draft. So in a way, when I go to write those scenes, I now have a launching off point, and I might heavily change what I have written as part of this snippet exercise, but at least I've got something to start with rather than just a blank page. So my hope with creating this outline and these 100 little snippets through the POV of the main characters, my hope is that all of this background information is going to make the writing of the first draft so much easier and so much cleaner and clearer and stronger than the word vomit that was my first draft, my 0 draft. So that's all I have for you today. I really hope you enjoyed this video and I hope that you got something out of it. I hope that what I've talked about here gave you some fresh ideas and that it was different than the types of videos that already exist about creating a first draft. If you want to leave a comment, please do so down below. Was any of this information helpful to you? Is there anything you'd like to share about how you approach a first draft? Whether that's outlining or through intuitive writing, I'd really love to hear. Now, if you'd like even more writing advice, you can of course check out the other videos on this channel or go to taraeast.com and dive into the archives. While you're there, please feel free to join my email newsletter. When you do, I'll send you a free gift, plus you'll receive a newsletter in your inbox every single Thursday morning, including a note by me, some links to that week's blog and video, as well as some recommendations I've recently enjoyed and think you will too, and some tidbits that I don't share anywhere other than email. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. Now go do some writing because the world actually does need more books.